Hey everyone, DJ Galicia Kid here. Just saying thanks for tuning in to RGV Community Health Hour. As a reminder, the views expressed on RGV Community Health Hour are for informational purposes only and do not constitute medical advice. Be sure to consult your primary care provider for all your healthcare needs. Unfortunately, today we don't have a guest, but I hope you'll stay tuned in anyway because I'm going to be sharing some relevant information in terms of stress and anxiety, because I know that, with finals coming up, that a lot of the student body is feeling that pressure of wrapping up the semester. So going to take a quick music break and come back and talk about all kinds of stuff relevant to RGV's health. So be sure to stay tuned. Thanks. All right, everyone. Thanks for staying tuned in. Welcome to this week's episode of RGV Community Health Hour, where we explore the science behind the issues that matter most to our region. As you probably already know, I'm your host, DJ Galicia Kid. And today we're putting the spotlight on something we all feel, but often don't talk enough about, which is stress. And the reason I bring that up is because April is National Stress Awareness Month. And with finals just around the corner, students across the valley are feeling the pressure. But stress doesn't just affect grades. It impacts our mental, physical, and emotional health in serious ways. And I can tell you on a personal basis that I am feeling that tremendously, but thankfully I go see a counselor every 2 weeks, and that helps me stay balanced. But today we'll break down what stress actually does to the body, how you can recognize when it's become a problem, and most importantly, how to manage it, with practical tips, local resources, and a few science-backed strategies. Whether you're a student juggling assignments, a parent trying to keep things balanced, or just someone feeling overwhelmed, today's show is for you. Let's talk about stress and how to take control of it. So, what is stress and why, knowing about stress matters? So, there are two kind of general types of stress. There's acute stress, where it's short-term, kind of situational. I guess you can kind of think about that, so our stress response was originally designed to help keep us alive whenever, when we were trying to survive in the savannas of Africa and animals were trying to hunt us down and eat us. It's basically the fight or flight response. And actually, I like to refer to it as, if y'all are probably familiar with the goats they're small goats, and they basically, when you freak them out, they don't fight or run. They just stiffen up and fall over and just act like wouldn't say they act like they're dead, but they just get so freaked out that their whole body stiffens up and they just tip over. So what I like to say, it's flight, fight, or fur. Like, you just like freak out and, there's no flight or fight. It's just like, just basically like those goats. And so like I mentioned, the acute stress is short-term, situational, kind of like cramming the night before a final. And then we have the chronic stress, which is really bad for you. And the chronic stress is ongoing, like financial instability, caregiving responsibilities, or untreated trauma. And then there's also two different types of stress. There's eustress, which is known as positive stress, and distress, which is, distress. Everyone knows what distress is. That's the negative stress. So eustress can improve performance. It's kind of like the adrenaline rush before a presentation. And a lot of us, might mistake that as distress because sometimes it can feel distressful. But if you go in with if you're prepared and you're ready, you still feel that anxiety. Oh, I don't know if anxiety is the right word, but you still feel that underlying, kind of feeling of like, man, I got to do this presentation, stand up in front of people, maybe something you're not too comfortable with. And, you start to feel that. And, I can tell you as someone who does presentations often, last week, I gave a presentation for our student organization, SEBA, the STEAM and Entrepreneurship Business Association. And so, things like that can cause stress, but a lot of times it's stress kind of just in preparation of something, not necessarily distress. So then distress reduces concentration and motivation, often leads to burnout. So how can you tell when good stress becomes harmful? Or are we trained to ignore stress until we hit a breaking point? And I feel like that's probably something more people experience than not. I wouldn't say we're trained. Well, I guess, trained and conditioned is kind of the same thing in a sense. But a lot of times we have to hit rock bottom before we decide to do something about it. And a lot of times, at that point, whether you have an anxiety attack or, just some kind of stressor that leads you to a doctor or to some kind of medical intervention, those are the points where you don't want the stress to get to. And so to talk a little bit about the science of stress, the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, is the stress control center in our brain. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline prepare the body for fight or flight, like I mentioned earlier. Fight, flight, or fur. And so the long-term effects of high cortisol are immune suppression. You get sick more often. And I mean, honestly, a lot of times I'm pretty good about not stressing, though, I'm human and I do stress. But whenever I stress more than I should, I really feel the physical toll it takes on my body. And of course, it disrupts our sleep. We have cognitive fog, and our grades start to be affected, or not just our grades, but our academic performance in general, whether that's, trying to focus on what's happening or being discussed in class, trying to focus in a study group, or things like that. And another long-term effect of high cortisol is weight gain, especially in the midsection due to insulin resistance. And then, of course, along with that is the is the increased risk of heart disease, anxiety disorders, and depression. So in one study, students' immune responses decreased during exam season, showing the physical toll of academic stress. And I'm telling you guys, I've been there before, and it's not fun. And the only way not the only way, but there are a variety of ways to mitigate that stress. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit later in the later segments of the show. So, there are, you need to be able to recognize the warning signs. Like I said, I'm pretty good about recognizing, like, hey, man, I need to go for a walk or do my breathing exercises because this is just kind of spinning out of control right now. So I encourage you to check in with your mind and body regularly. I feel like a lot of us don't pay enough attention to what our body is trying to tell us. We might think that I can't say we might think, but basically, when you stress so much, you start to maybe feel nauseous or like that underlying weird feeling that you get. And that's your body telling you, like, whoa, man, you need to take it easy, go do something that can get your mind off whatever is bothering you. And I know a lot of times that's hard because, everywhere we turn, there's, especially, I feel over the last few months, there's like a palpable, like just underlying tension that people are experiencing more and more. And I don't know if that has to do with the unknowns of, what's going on in terms of politics and, associated things like that. But, like I said, you need to check in with your mind and body, and some emotional signs are increased irritability, mood swings, or tearfulness, feeling overwhelmed or hopeless as well. So I feel like that's probably more geared towards the way I feel, especially with all the stuff that I, try to fill my plate up with. Because for me, I go crazier in not having enough to do rather than having too much to do. So for me, keeping myself very busy helps me stay sane, essentially. So yeah, I might have some stress from, having to do my PhD program doing the show, small business, entrepreneurial endeavors, student organization. I'm also a parent, and it goes on and on and on, and it can get overwhelming sometimes and feel hopeless. And so some behavioral signs are avoiding work and responsibilities. Those are things I try not to do, because the more that stuff piles up, the more stressful it seems. And like I was mentioning earlier, for me, it's, for me, I just kind of go crazy when I don't have anything, I wouldn't say anything to do, because, I feel like we always have something to do, whether it's work, school, stuff around the house, taking care of our loved ones or our kids. And so for me, it's easier to make the days go by and kind of feel more balanced whenever I have multiple things to juggle, because whenever I don't have anything to do, I kind of, I experience this more when I wasn't in school, of course, because whenever you're a student, it's seemingly, the things to do never end. And so prior to becoming a student at UTRGV, and prior to my employment where I was working at before I came to UTRGV for this PhD program, I was a stay-at-home dad for a good while, for over a year. And while I loved it, it was kind of driving me crazy, because I think, I've probably mentioned it in the radio show before. I spent 5 years in the military, got out, spent 5 years getting my undergrad degrees. And so I spent a decade of my life kind of just being really, really busy. And then when I became a stay-at-home dad, I was still busy because I had young kids to take care of, and, of course, the household to take care of and things like that. But, those things were just a fraction of what kept me busy as an undergrad, because I had those same things as an undergrad on top of school. And so whenever I was, kind of in that limbo area of graduating and not quite yet finding a job, I just felt lost, and I became really, really depressed, more depressed than probably I've ever been in my life. And it was hard, but it was really a mindset change that I took on that kind of helped change my life around. And so, try not to avoid work or those are the behavioral signs, right, of too much stress. We just say, forget it all. I'm done. I don't want to go to work or take care of my responsibilities. And that ultimately just is a bad road to go down. You can also have increased screen time, over-caffeination, or substance use. And some physical signs are tension headaches. I know a lot of people go through that. Upset stomach. I feel that sometimes, like I said, it's not really that nauseous feeling. I guess that's one way to describe it, but it's just like this underlying, like, terrible, just gut feeling you get. It's just like, man, this is just too much, and I'm going crazy right now. Muscle tightness and fatigue. So how do we mistake these symptoms as just being lazy or unmotivated instead of recognizing them as stress? And I think that's one thing that's kind of it's kind of culturally drilled into us, especially because a lot of people, regardless of how stressed they are or what they have going on, they have to get up and go to work to pay the bills, because there's no other way around it. And so sometimes we may mistake these symptoms as something that they're not. And so I'm going to go into a quick music break, and then when we come back, I'm going to talk about some things to manage stress and some tools that you can implement to help mitigate those feelings and, try to get through the hard times. So be sure to stay tuned, everyone. Thanks. All right, everyone. Thanks for staying tuned in. So like I mentioned before the music break, we're going to talk about some tools that can help you manage your stress. So the first would be time and task management. It's of course a big one, because, as students, there's never-ending work with projects, homework, of course, trying to study and become a better engineer, or this is one of the things I mentioned in the workshop I hosted last week. I think it was last week. All these weeks kind of blend together for me, but is that we just kind of need to recognize that we have to be able to manage our time and tasks, and with the never-ending things to do, it can be overwhelming. But you have to just break those things down into bite-sized portions. Essentially, one thing that they like to say is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? It might seem like an impossible task, but the only way to do it is to take it piece at a time. So one thing you can use is the Pomodoro technique, which is essentially just working for 25 minutes and giving yourself a 5-minute break. So, basically 10-minute break for every hour of work. And that's something that I should probably do more of myself, because seemingly I just work nonstop, whether, I live in McAllen and I have to rush to Brownsville in the morning. Well, I can't say I have to rush, but I commute to Brownsville every morning. And as soon as I get here, I go to the lab, start, leave my stuff in my office, head to the vivarium to work with our lab animals, do the lab animal work. And for me, I only eat once a day, so I only eat dinner. And so I work through breakfast and lunch, essentially. And those times, those are times, and not to say that I don't take walks occasionally, I do make sure I get moving around and give myself small breaks, but it's definitely not 5 or 10 minutes for every hour. And so yeah, I'll work with the animals through lunch a lot of times, and then go back to my office and do other lab work in our other laboratories. And then I, of course, have to, prepare presentations for lab meetings, or, read research papers that are relevant to the projects I'm working on, and write papers for submission to academic journals. And they're seemingly never-ending work, but that's kind of one thing that you have to realize at some point. You can work all 24 hours in the day, or, you can work 22 hours in the day, take 2 hours of sleep, but the next day there's still a mountain of work to do, and the work never ends. So you need to, prioritize taking breaks and some quote unquote me time. You can prioritize, like I mentioned, prioritizing the things using the Eisenhower matrix, which is basically kind of choosing what's urgent and what's important. So an example of that, and, I could talk about kind of as an overview, is in our laboratory, this gene knockout stuff we're working on. It's the highest priority in the lab because that's what pays the bills for the lab. We were given money from the government through a grant to do this work, and we're behind on the work. And so, not to any fault of our own, one of the capillaries we used to do the injections for this genetic engineering work was on back order for like 6 months. And so, the capillaries they originally gave us were not useful, basically. And so we had to put in an order for more of those capillaries. And they said, like, hey, we just bought this capillary company. The company that was making the capillaries was acquired by another company. And whenever that happened, there was just, a big backlog in terms of the manufacturing and the way things are made for those capillaries. And so that put us behind on top of other things. So it's not always in our hands, and which can be kind of troublesome sometimes. But those are especially the things you don't want to worry about, or things that you can't control. Because if you worry about the things you can't control, that will just give you more unnecessary stress than you need. And the way I've talked to my mental health, my counselor, shout out to Bo. I've talked to him before about this. I'm really, really good about not letting things that I can't control bother me. But the second that the things that I can't control don't bother me, but the second they impact my ability to work or to live my life or do things like that, that's when it starts to get under my skin a little bit. Because I can't control it, but it's also keeping me from being able to do X, Y, Z. And so, we need to do our best at that in terms of just, putting those things to the side and trying to not let them affect us too much. And then another one is don't aim for perfection, progress over perfection. So I know that engineers and engineering students are always kind of striving for perfection in their projects or in their presentations. And a lot of times I kind of, it's like what they call paralysis by analysis, right? You're just paralyzed because you're overanalyzing things. And instead of, trying to just put something out, and nothing that we do, whether it's a piece of art, a writing that we've done, a presentation, or anything, nothing that we do the first time is going to be our best effort, right? It takes iteration, it takes practice, it takes kind of honing a skill, and you just get better with time. So, that's one thing that I kind of struggle with myself, is kind of always not necessarily trying to go for perfection, but just trying to go for something that meets my standards. And a lot of times, that's not necessarily to say that I'm always striving for perfection, but just trying to, put out work that makes me happy. And a lot of times I want it to be more than it should, whenever I can just put something down right away and start thinking about it in bigger context. We were just sent a paper, an academic paper, talking about how, we need to stop procrastinating and start writing, because the only way to truly think is to write. Because whenever we think, all our thoughts are very abstract and going crazy, bouncing off the walls of our skull inside of our head. And the only way to kind of stop that from happening is to take your ideas, take whatever's going around in your head, put it down on paper and write. Make it tangible so you can see it, you can feel it, you can analyze it, and that kind of helps move that ball, giving that, moving that ball forward, I guess you could say. And so, of course, physical activity is very important in terms of not only our physical health, but our mental health. So any movement counts, whether you're dancing, walking, stretching. Like I mentioned, there are times whenever I'm just like, I need to go for a walk. Whenever I'm in the lab, and I just kind of realize that, man, I've been in here too long. I need to go out and get some sun. And stretching. I love to stretch. I love to hang. In terms of just like grabbing a pull-up bar. You don't even have to do the pull-up. Just grab a pull-up bar and hang, and it just feels amazing, and your body will thank you for it. Movement helps flush out stress hormones and boost serotonin. And then, of course, the UT RGV Rec Center and student groups often host free fitness sessions. And one group that I see that's very active is the running group here on the Brownsville campus. So shout out to them in terms of, getting groups together multiple times a week, I want to say. And they do really cool things. So, always look for those student groups and keep an eye out for the rec center, because they do a lot of cool things too in terms of trying to get the students active. And one of my personal favorites is breathing and mindfulness. So a simple technique is called box breathing, where you inhale for 4 seconds, you hold for 4 seconds, you exhale for 4 seconds, and then you hold for 4 seconds. And so, basically that's probably my strongest tool in my toolbox, is doing breathing techniques, because it's saved me a lot of times in terms of, me being mad and wanting to lash out and being like, man, it's not worth it. Just breathe, get the stress away, breathe through it. Me being anxious about something in terms of presentations or just chaos in the world. Like what I mentioned with when I had David Norick on my show, we had talked about, South Texas AuthorCon. And it was very overwhelming to have a bunch of young kids, elementary age kids, kind of running around chaotic. And it was a lot. So I did have to do some of my breathing exercises because it was a bit overwhelming. But it was awesome, not overwhelming in a bad way. It was just a lot of environmental stimuli, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is kind of insane. But it was great. And I can't wait to do it again. And of course, you can always download apps. Everybody, has a smartphone these days, seemingly, and there are a billion apps on the app stores. So you can download apps like Insight Timer, Headspace, or Calm. And then the final thing before we go into another music break is digital detox and boundaries. So I encourage you all to log off social media during study blocks or before bed. You know, one thing they mentioned is, especially for kids, because obviously the kids' brains are still developing, and so having them have their mobile devices, you know, of course, it's up to the parents to limit their use and kind of keep aware of what they're doing on their mobile devices, but keeping those things out of the bedroom, you know, because a lot of times you go lay down in bed and you're just on your phone kind of doom scrolling, and before you know it, that, you know, extra hour of sleep you could have got was just spent mindlessly looking on stuff on, you know, Instagram or Facebook. And you can create a tech-free zone, like during meals or after 10 p.m. So me personally, I only started my social media accounts when I became a small business owner, because the unfortunate reality of businesses today is, you know, for most businesses anyway, you need social media, whether it's for marketing, to loop in customers, or to get the word out about events happening for your business. So social media is really important for businesses, and it's always good to track those times. You know, all the I can't say all, but social media platforms have settings that let you know, like, hey, this is how much time you're spending every day or every week on this platform. I checked my Instagram maybe like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or so, and I spend an average of 5 minutes a day on Instagram. And I try to minimize my social media use as much as possible, because a lot of times that stuff it really drives me crazy, because I see things and I'm just like, what in the world are they talking about, or what in the world is going on here? And so one quote I want to share before going into the music break is, almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. So with that, we're going to take a quick music break and come right back for our last segment. So stay tuned, everyone. Thanks. Hey, everyone. Thanks for staying tuned in. I can't believe we're coming up on our hour. I swear these Vaquero radio, you know, booths, or, you know, where we do the radio shows, it feels like a place that dilates time, because it does not feel like I've been here for an hour already. But to end the show, we wanted to talk about some resources for students and the RGV community. So the UT RGV Counseling Center, they host workshops, and of course have emergency services and individual counseling sessions. So I highly recommend, you know, I'm a part of the UT RGV students Facebook group, and I have seen more and more students, and it might have something to do with finals coming up, but a lot more students are seemingly reaching out for those services and asking questions about, like, hey, how do I set up an appointment and things like that. And so my hope is, I tried to have them on today, and unfortunately it was too short notice. And of course they're counselors, so they have their clients that they deal with. So he wasn't able to make it. But for next week, I'm hoping to have one of the counselors from UTRGV's counseling centers come on to talk about, you know, what they provide and how you can set up appointments, and just have a discussion with them. So be sure to tune in next week if that sounds like something you'd be interested in listening to. And I encourage group study sessions, and you know, to help reduce isolation. A lot of time, honestly, as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, those are really the keys to success. You know, yeah, I know we have unlimited resources with YouTube and Khan Academy and all these great online learning tools, but there's nothing better than just bouncing ideas off another person or in a group and working on homework or school assignments with people from your class. So one thing I can mention quickly is when I was taking General Chemistry 2 as an undergraduate, one of my classmates and I, every day after class, we would head, right after class, we would go to Starbucks, and we would not only do the homework, but kind of just review what was covered in class that day. Every class day, we would do that after class. And because of those habits we built, we both got A's in the class. And so it's really helpful. And then, of course, as I continued on into my academic journey, taking engineering classes, they're tough to kind of grasp whenever you're a young engineer in training. And that's not really the proper word because there are EITs out there. But whenever you're a young engineering student trying to learn the engineering ways, it's tough because your brain isn't used to kind of thinking in that manner. And it's no different for a lot of the STEM fields. So you really have to train your brain, and it helps to have other people to do it. And then, of course, there are local community clinics. They may offer sliding scale mental health services. And by sliding scale, I mean in terms of your income. And one of those is Tropical Texas Behavioral Health. And I've actually heard a lot of great things about Tropical Texas. And as a veteran myself, they give resources to veterans and things like that. So I highly recommend looking up Tropical Texas if that's something, services you're seeking. And of course, finally, churches and student organizations can provide supportive environments even outside a clinical setting. I know a lot of people attend church, a lot of religious, there are religious student organizations as well. So really, it's about trying to not isolate yourself, and though sometimes that might be exactly what you need, it should probably never be too long of a term. It is good to kind of self-reflect, and the only way to really do that, I think, is to spend maybe a little bit of time by yourself, but it all depends on who you are, right? It's not really a black and white issue. There's a lot of gray area, of course, as with many issues like that. And so now that we're getting up to our time to wrap up the episode. So today's episode was on stress for National Stress Awareness Month. And remember that stress is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're human. Whether you're a student juggling final exams, a parent balancing work and family, or just someone navigating the challenges of everyday life, stress affects us all. And that's one thing I always like to point out. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your job title is. It doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank. None of this stuff matters. We all have to deal with the ups and downs of life. And the important thing is to stay as balanced as possible. Never get too high with the wins. Never get too low with the losses, because these are just temporary moments. As much as they seem like they hurt, or as much as it seems like you're on top of the world, these are just parts of the human experience. And so the key isn't to eliminate it, but to learn how to manage it in healthy and sustainable ways. If something you heard today resonated with you, take it as a sign to check in with yourself. Talk to a friend, take a walk, breathe deeply. And if you need more support, know that there are resources out there on campus and in the community. And of course, right here on this show. So thank you for tuning in to RGV Community Health Hour. Like I mentioned earlier, next week I hope to have someone from the counseling center to come on and we can kind of continue on this topic. But until then, be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, and take care of your health, because it's the foundation of everything else. And as always, stay curious, stay healthy, and let's thrive together, RGV.